When you think of Al Pacino, you probably hear the roar. You hear the gravelly high-decibel crescendos of Scent of a Woman, or the frantic, desperate energy of Dog Day Afternoon. You think of the man who redefined the anti-hero, the man who brought an operatic intensity to the American screen. But if you ask the people who have actually sat across from him in the high-stakes poker game of a film set, they'll tell you a different story. They'll tell you that the loudest thing about Al Pacino isn't his voice, it's his silence. You know Kevin Spacey. Spacey is an Academy Award winner, a man who built a career on being a chameleon, and he does what most people think is a pretty good impression of Pacino. He does the shouting, the eyes bulging, the hoo-ah that has become a staple of late-night talk show parodies. But Al doesn't see it that way. In his world, the caricature is a distraction from the truth. Al Pacino doesn't flip tables. He doesn't throw adolescent tantrums just to get his way. He doesn't need to. When Pacino wants to end a relationship, when he decides that a professional partnership has reached its terminal point, he goes quiet. And when Al Pacino cuts you off, he doesn't just burn the bridge, he buries the entire landscape in a shroud of absolute permanent silence. To understand the steel in his soul, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when Al Pacino was just a scruffy theater kid from the Bronx whom nobody wanted. During the filming of The Godfather, the atmosphere was not one of reverence. It was one of constant grinding anxiety. Paramount didn't want him. They saw a little guy, a nobody, with a strange internal energy that they didn't think would translate to the big screen. They wanted Robert Redford or Warren Beatty, someone with the classic Hollywood jawline. They even tried to fire him multiple times during the first few weeks of shooting. Pacino knew this. He felt the cold breath of the executives on his neck every single day. Even Marlon Brando, the icon he grew up idolizing, was a source of massive stress. Brando was the king, and Al was the interloper. That experience forged something in him, a fierce protective instinct over his craft, and a low tolerance for anyone he felt didn't respect the work. For decades, he has been the heartbeat of modern cinema, carrying the legacy of the method on his shoulders from Serpico to The Irishman. But behind the scenes, away from the gold statues and the standing ovations, Pacino has navigated a career filled with quiet wars. He has walked away from legendary directors, clashed with the most powerful icons in the industry, and quietly blacklisted co-stars with a cold finality that is as terrifying as it is impressive. He doesn't do PR cleanups. He doesn't go on apology tours. If you make the list, you're not getting off it. The first major casualty of Pacino's exacting standards was William Friedkin. In 1980, Pacino partnered with the director of The Exorcist for a dark, gritty dive into the New York underground titled Cruising. On paper, it was a match made in heaven, two of the most intense, boundary-pushing artists of their generation collaborating on a provocative thriller. But what began as creative synergy soon dissolved into a vat of professional contempt. Friedkin, a man of meticulous discipline and rigid control, expected Pacino to show up like a soldier, rehearsed, disciplined, and ready to execute. Instead, Pacino arrived in the throes of his own internal process. He was often late. He hadn't fully memorized the scripted lines, and he insisted on improvising in ways that shattered Friedkin's carefully constructed frames. The director, never one for subtlety, later remarked that Pacino treated the set like a frat house. The tension was thick enough to choke the crew. Late-night shouting matches echoed through the streets of Greenwich Village. Pacino, visceral and strong-willed, resented Friedkin's attempt to cage his performance. Reports say Friedkin nearly fired him on multiple occasions, and after the film wrapped, the director didn't mince words, calling Pacino the biggest disappointment I've ever worked with. It wasn't just an anecdote, it was a verdict. Al Pacino didn't fight back in the press. He didn't offer a rebuttal. He simply erased Friedkin from his reality. There were no joint interviews, no 20-year reunions, and certainly no second collaborations. Friedkin learned the hard way that Al Pacino doesn't forgive what he perceives as a lack of respect for his process. Then there was James Foley. When Glengarry Glen Ross hit theaters in 1992, the world saw a masterclass in ensemble acting. Pacino's performance as Ricky Roma was sharp, raw, and tightly coiled, a volcanic display of salesman bravado. But behind the camera, the relationship between Pacino and Foley was a constant tug-of-war. Foley was known for a precise visual style, a director who wanted tension through control. Pacino, however, wanted fire. He would shift his tone, mid-take, drop scripted lines to see how his co-stars would react, and refuse to rehearse a scene the same way twice. To Foley, this was exhausting, a chaotic energy that threatened to derail his vision. To Pacino, it was the only way to find the truth of the scene. While the film was a critical triumph, the electricity on set short-circuited any future for the two men. Pacino, a man who famously develops decades-long bonds with directors like Brian De Palma, never looked in Foley's direction again. When Foley was asked years later if he'd direct Al a second time, he gave a tight, thin smile and said, "Some performances are best left once." In the quiet, lethal vocabulary of Hollywood that is as final as it gets. Even the legendary Marlon Brando was not immune to the Pacino frost. This is perhaps the most complicated relationship in Al's history. In the early 70s, Brando was the shadow that loomed over every young actor, and Pacino revered him. But as The Godfather progressed, that reverence was tinged with a growing sense of resentment. Brando was given every grace by the studio. He could show up late, ad-lib his way through scenes, and clash with Coppola without fear of reprisal. Pacino, meanwhile, was treated like a replaceable part. The double standard gnawed at him. The peak of this tension arrived during the 1973 Academy Awards. Brando was nominated for Best Actor, while Pacino, despite being the central protagonist of the film with the most screen time, was relegated to the Best Supporting Actor category. Feeling snubbed by the industry and frustrated by Brando's outsized credit, Pacino didn't just complain, he boycotted. He refused to attend the ceremony, a move that stunned the establishment. Over time, the two men drifted into separate orbits. They never reunited on screen, and while Pacino would always offer polite admiration for Brando in public, the warmth was gone. Brando became a shadow, a legacy of a rivalry that Pacino chose to bury under his own burgeoning legend. Perhaps the most famous partnership that actually holds a secret icy core is the one with Robert De Niro. Grouped together as the twin titans of American film, the world desperately wants them to be best friends, two old lions sharing stories over red wine in a quiet Italian restaurant. They've shared billing in Heat, Righteous Kill, and The Irishman, but the reality is far more professional than personal. When Heat was filming in the mid-90s, the world was waiting for their first face-to-face scene. But behind the camera, they kept their distance. De Niro is a craftsman, quiet, prepared, internal. Pacino is a storm, instinctual, loud and free. They didn't bond. They existed as separate weather systems heading for the same collision point. Michael Mann had to direct them like two different species. Pacino once noted, "Bobby's a craftsman. I'm more instinct. We work differently." It wasn't a slight, but it wasn't a warm embrace either. On the set of The Irishman, decades later, the energy was professional but cold. No laughing between takes, no bonding over the craft. Scorsese acted as a buffer between two tectonic plates of cinema. When Pacino says, "We're not friends, we just show up," he isn't being mean. He's being honest about a legendary pairing that never really clicked on a human level. Even the most beautiful of stars were not exempt from the Pacino blacklist. When Scarface was being cast, Michelle Pfeiffer was the underdog. A relatively unknown actress fighting for the role of Elvira Hancock. Pacino was openly skeptical. According to multiple insiders, he initially resisted her casting, telling producers she was too soft, that she lacked the icy, jagged edge needed to play Tony Montana's jaded queen. Pfeiffer could feel the disapproval radiating off him during the auditions. She admitted in later interviews that she knew he didn't want her there. While she eventually won the role and delivered a performance that remains iconic, the friction on set was palpable. Pacino remained distant, keeping her at arm's length throughout the entire grueling shoot. There was no warm-up, no real connection, just the cold professionalism of a man who had already decided she wasn't his equal. They never worked together again, and while Pfeiffer has always maintained her admiration for his talent, The silence between them for the last 40 years says everything that needs to be said. Finally, we have to talk about Gene Hackman. Two legends of the 70s, two masters of the craft, but they only shared the screen once in 1973's Scarecrow. The film was a critical success, a raw, stripped-down human drama, but behind the scenes, the two men repelled each other like magnets with the same polarity. Pacino was the sensitive, method-driven introvert. Hackman was the blunt, gruff professional who valued efficiency above all else. Hackman reportedly found Pacino's pace to be wasteful, a distraction from the job at hand. To Hackman, Al was wasting time exploring feelings when there were marks to be hit. The tension never exploded into a tabloid scandal, but it created a divide that never closed. After Scarecrow, there were no more pairings, no joint retrospectives, no fond memories shared in the press. They were two legends who refused to share the stage more than once. Al Pacino didn't slam the door. He just made sure it stayed locked. Al Pacino's legacy is undeniable. He is the man who gave us Michael Corleone, Frank Serpico, and Tony Montana. But his real legacy is the absolute purity with which he protects his world. He isn't interested in the theater of Hollywood feuds. He doesn't want the drama of a public spat. He just wants the truth of the work. And if you can't provide that, or if you infringe upon his ability to find it, you simply cease to exist in his professional world. He closes the door. He walks off the set, and he never looks back. In an industry built on the second act and the reconciliation, Pacino's silence is the most final cut of all. You don't hear the argument, you don't see the tabloid headlines. You just notice years later who never showed up in the frame with him again. He doesn't burn bridges, he buries them. And as the final credits roll on his storied career, that silence remains the most powerful performance he's ever given. If you look closely at the history of modern film, you can see the gaps where these six people once stood, people who thought they were his equals, only to find themselves frozen out by the coldest fire in Hollywood. Pacino's instinct for people is as sharp as his instinct for a scene, and if you're on the list, you stay there, forever. That is the quiet, devastating truth of Al Pacino, a man who carries the world on his shoulders, but doesn't have room for anyone who can't carry their own weight. He made his choice, he stood his ground, and in the end, the silence was the only thing that mattered. As we look back at these fractured relationships, we see a pattern that defines the man. Pacino is a purist. He is a man who came from nothing, who fought through the rejection of Paramount and the skepticism of the industry to become the benchmark of excellence. He doesn't have time for ego unless it serves the character. He doesn't have time for sloppiness, even if it comes from a director of Friedkin's stature. And he certainly doesn't have time for the performative friendships that Hollywood so often demands. The actors he froze out aren't necessarily bad people or bad artists. They were simply the wrong fit for the volcanic, unpredictable weather that is an Al Pacino performance. When he says he doesn't flip tables, he's telling you that his power doesn't come from a physical outburst. It comes from the withdrawal of his energy. To be in Al Pacino's presence on a film set is to be in the center of a storm, and if you can't handle the pressure, if you can't match the frequency, the storm simply moves on without you. The story of the last name on this list, the one even the director refuses to talk about, is perhaps the most telling. It involves a project that was almost lost to history, a collaboration that was so bitter it allegedly remains under a non-disclosure agreement of the soul. In the late 90s, a project was whispered about a reunion that would have shaken the industry, but it collapsed within weeks of pre-production. The reason Pacino went quiet. He saw something, felt a shift in the rhythm, and he walked. He didn't ask for a rewrite. He didn't ask for a new director. He just left, and in his wake, the project evaporated. That director, now retired, was asked at a festival years later what happened with Al, and he simply shook his head looking away and said, "There are some ghosts you don't wake up. That is the power of the Pacino freeze. It isn't just a professional decision, it's a spiritual one." He protects the sanctity of the work with a ferocity that is unmatched. In the end, Al Pacino's journey is a testament to the fact that to reach the absolute summit of your craft, you have to be willing to walk alone. He has shared the screen with the best, but he has never been defined by them. He is Michael Corleone, the man who had to kill his own brother to save the family. He is Tony Montana, the man who stood alone against an army. And in real life, he is the man who chooses silence over compromise every single time. He doesn't need to yell to be heard. He doesn't need to flip a table to show his strength. He just needs to look you in the eye, find the truth, and if it's not there, he'll cut you off so deep, you'll never even feel the blade. That is the genius and the tragedy of Al Pacino, the heartbeat of cinema and its most silent judge. When the lights go down and the theater falls quiet, we are all left in that same silence. He has mastered the silence that follows a man who doesn't just play a role, but lives it with a fire that eventually consumes everything and everyone in its path. If you're lucky, you get to witness the fire. If you're not, you're just another name on the list, a buried bridge in the long, storied history of the man who refused to be anything less than legendary. Hooah!